Hi. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. This is our program of today. So focus on Russia, on Putin's rise to power, on the European Union, and on our stance in the Ukrainian war, in the war that Russia has inflicted upon Ukraine. And we'll return to the question of what is our stance on the two contradicting principles of international law, namely the right of states to defend their sovereignty and their borders and their territory, and the right of national groups for self-determination, that is, to also break out of existing states. In this situation that we're in, I would like to start with Greenland. If you look at this map, this is a very unusual map because it shows you the Arctic region. And what you can see is Greenland is between Canada and Europe, but also Russia is very close to it. So this is the Arctic Ocean and Greenland in it. There are different claims to Greenland, and it was a very hot topic in the fall. And it's the beginning of a journey of the Trump administration that now ended up in Iran, obviously. Whose Greenland is it? There is now, today, I believe, a discussion of the Nordic states. There is the European Nordic states, but also Canada, that discuss their stance towards the Trump administration's claim to Greenland, and where the Canadian Prime Minister plays a big role, but also the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, who are united by their firm stance against any claims by the US administration that Greenland should be American, should be United States property. But whose sovereignty is at stake? On the one hand, you would say it's the Greenlanders. That is the people who live there, the indigenous communities, plus Danish people. Today, most of them, if not all, Danish citizens, and by being Danish citizens, also citizens of the European Union. They have their autonomy, which means Greenland is a part of the Kingdom of Denmark. And they have their own parliament, their own government, and they have always been toying with the idea of a referendum for independence. So from the perspective of the two poles of principles of international law, there is on the one hand the principle of the sovereignty of Denmark, of the Kingdom of Denmark, and on the other hand, the right of the local population to take their fate into their own hands. At this point, there is no talk about referenda, but there has been a strong solidarity in Denmark with Greenland and of Greenlanders with Denmark in the light of the Trump administration's claim. For Denmark, Greenland is a former colonial possession, which means much bigger than the homeland, right? And at the same time, very sparsely populated. Only some pieces of Greenland are inhabited. Obviously, Greenland has not been high on the agenda of Denmark for ages. We are now learning about atrocities that the Danish committed in Greenland over the 20th century, so not so far ago, in terms of making indigenous women unable to bear children, and having a very strong regime, also control of the population. That is, Greenland has always been treated as a second, if not third rank point of interest for Denmark. And this all comes up right at the point when there is a major crisis. This crisis is major, and although the United States have toned down their aggressive stance on Greenland, it's still there. And this is why we discuss it, or why the leaders discuss it. For the US, the argument was that Denmark is a defense necessity for the United States, as it is a kind of buffer zone between the United States and Russia, between the United States and China maybe. There are also resource interests involved, and you know that the Trump administration is very much into fossil fuels and fossil industries, and in resources of the country that should be under the rights of US companies. So there is a material interest that plays a role in all of the international relations that the Trump administration is doing. From the European Union perspective, Greenland is not on our maps. You see a map of the European Union? Greenland is not there. And this is because Greenland once was part of the European community, but then moved out of it in 1980-something, 85 or 86, because of a fishery conflict. It wanted to remain sovereign in the fisheries around Greenland, and they're very rich, but they're very coveted also by other nations, including of the European Union. Which means this resource, fish, was very strong in the 1980s, even leading to the Grexit, if you wish, of Greenland. But at the same time, Greenland, of course, remained in the Kingdom of Denmark, and thereby also the inhabitants, the citizens of Greenland, remained citizens of the European Union with free traffic and you name it. It then became what we call overseas countries and territories, including, this would also pertain, for instance, to some French possessions in the Caribbean, but also the Canary Islands, for instance. That is, with a special status, not part of the European Union maps as you see it here, but at the same time connected to it. So that was in the fall. That was the big thing in the fall, because if Greenland was occupied by the Americans, who already have military bases there, the only real military base is an American one, and who already have shown their interest in annexing it, in taking it really into possession of the US, then this would be a major conflict within NATO. What would the Dutch or the Germans or the British have to do if one NATO member is occupying and annexing the territory of another one? Then this was toned down, and then came the Maduro kind of adventure. So a new type of warfare, a new type of intervention. We have seen all kinds of intervention in the 20th century. So bombing, moving out again, invasion, staying there. This is a new type, killing the leader or capturing the leader. This is what was done with the Venezuelan President Maduro. Nicolas Maduro was assaulted by American helicopters, so they killed a couple of bodyguards around him, went into Caracas, capital of Venezuela, took him on the helicopter and flew him to New York, where supposedly he's going to be charged with accusations of drug smuggling in the first place. So Maduro was painted by the administration, by the Trump administration, as a major hub for smuggling drugs into the United States. The whole procedure had been preceded by bombings of boats, of Venezuelan boats, but also boats of other nationalities in the Caribbean by the Americans, by American fighting planes and missiles and drones and whatnot. Also explained as a measure against the intrusion of drug smugglers into the United States. Observers have been saying that this is a pretext because most of the drug smuggling goes via land and has nothing to do with these boats that usually go into the Caribbean and go back. So a new kind of regime change idea, but at the same time the regime hasn't changed because Maduro is gone, but his deputy, she's now running the affairs. We do not know how far she is running the affairs of Venezuela according to the orders that she gets from Washington. But obviously, for Trump, this situation has been cleared. It's a clear victory because Maduro is the trophy that he brought home to New York. And at the same time, there are hopes that American companies would now develop the Venezuelan oil sector. The oil sector is very rich in Venezuela, which makes Venezuela standing out from the surrounding countries, Colombia and Mexico, also big drug smuggling countries, but at the same time, no oil. Which means this was obviously, again, linked to ideas about resources in that country that would fall, in the Western Hemisphere, would fall into American interest areas. From this on, there was obviously the idea that the same kind of quick intrusion plan could also be implemented in Iran. With the huge bomb attacks that started on 28 February, immediately the supreme leader of Iran was killed, and some people from his entourage, his wife, but also several important military persons, they obviously made the mistake of convening at one point, and there was intelligence where they were. The Israelis and the Americans have been witnessing all the kind of movements that the leaders have been doing. And obviously the time of this hitting was prepared in advance, but was then conditioned by the opportunity to kill the leader of Iran. Since then, there have been lots of conflicting storylines coming from the Trump administration about regime change. In the beginning, he started to talk about this is in order to free the Iranian nation, and against the background of big protests in January that were repressed heavily with many thousand people killed in Iran. We don't know the real number. Maybe 20,000, maybe 30,000 people killed. That's what human rights organizations tell us. This seems to be a kind of legitimate interest to bring down such a regime that kills its own population. However, Trump himself and his people have been toning down this motivation for the war and have in the past weeks more focused on the resource question. That is the same kind of pattern that we saw with Greenland and with Maduro. Trump has been saying at one point this can last on for months because we're prepared, we will continue, we will strike even harder. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of places in Iran that have been bombed by Israel and by the United States. He's also been talking about negotiations that were still going on. So with whom is he negotiating? We don't know. And then he suddenly lost interest. That was the news of last week. Obviously, he's now more interested in bringing this to a close without regime change, because obviously the son of the supreme ruler has been reconfirmed in power. So there's a new supreme leader of Iran with the same name, even Khamenei. And the government hasn't been backing down. The government of Iran continues to show up on TV, and the military is not defeated at all. They still send missiles and drones, and not just to American bases in the vicinity, but also into the cities of Kuwait, of the United Arab Emirates, into Israel, of course, but also Saudi Arabia. With other words, these countries around Iran are now very concerned, not just by these drones that keep on coming down on their oil fields, but also about the Strait of Hormuz, which is the kind of a passing point for all the oil production of these countries. And this is the latest news that I saw today here. Trump warns NATO faces very bad future if allies do not help secure the Strait of Hormuz. With other words, he seems to be putting the burden on securing this strait and thereby securing the world supply with oil from the area onto NATO, onto European powers in the first place. Right? If you look at this, then you again see that the Europeans are very careful. On the one hand, European diplomats like Kaja Kallas is very careful to say, yes, we are interested, of course, in keeping the oil lines. This is very important for our economy. We're going to run into a world economic crisis, and we have to keep this trade open. That's clear to everybody. Not Europe alone, but in particular China, India, and other countries depend very much on the oil coming from the region. So obviously something has to be done about that. If Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz and is attacking oil tankers that pass by, obviously not every tanker, but if you put mines there, water mines, then it becomes unpassable, and somebody will have to clean it up while being shot at by the Iranians. There is a French aircraft carrier going into the Eastern Mediterranean with support from a Dutch frigate. With other words, the Europeans are close by and moving into the scenario, while at the same time saying we have to be very careful about that. And here you see a statement from the German Minister of Foreign Affairs, Wadepool, who says, this is not our war. We are not going to be dragged into this confrontation. Can, however, be a situation of the very near future. The Americans really call upon NATO, just like the quote of Trump that I just showed you. If Trump says this is an attack on the United States, then the European allies of the US might be put before the question whether we want to support the US in this war that all experts of international law tell us has no justification in international law and not by the United States, by the United Nations. I'm now moving closely to Russia. What does Russia have from this war? On the one hand, it lost an ally, another ally. It lost Syria, it lost Maduro, who was close to Russia, and the Venezuelan oil production went partly to Russia and was then from Russia shipped to other places. Maduro was close to the Kremlin. Iran is not what it was before. It's still a big nuisance, and it might be a cause for an economic crisis that will hit us all, but it's still there. So Putin has not lost Iran, but he has also been a very bad ally. He hasn't been supporting Iran. With other words, the prestige of Putin, and we will talk about the great power status that Putin has been projecting, the idea that Russia is on the same level as the United States and China, not to speak about the Europeans. This has been scratched. This image of Russia as a global player has been seriously damaged. At the same time, Russia also gains a lot from this war. On the one hand, this is another erosion of the principle of international law, and that comes in very handy for Russia and for the Kremlin, because it means there will be less argumentation against what Putin has been doing against Ukraine. Ukraine is hammering on the right of sovereignty, of the inviolability of Ukrainian territory and borders, and the population, of course, whereas Putin has been hammering on the sovereignty of the Russians in Ukraine, the so-called Russians that, he says, the Ukrainians have been repressing and have been preparing to kill. That's Putin's false allegations, false accusations of Ukraine. Putin has also been benefiting from this war because the oil prices have been going up. You saw that if you have a car, you see it at the station. This means Russian oil is much more coveted than it has been before. If the major oil producers of the Middle East are caught in the Strait of Hormuz with hundreds of tankers now waiting to be allowed to pass by, this means that Russia can send its oil and gas to countries that try to get rid of it. India, for example. India promised to Trump a couple of months ago that they would reduce the number of the amount of oil being imported from Russia. Now everybody is happy to get Russian oil back, and Trump even allowed the US, and thereby the world, to buy more Russian oil in order to overcome the threat of a crisis. So obviously he realized that the US strike was badly prepared when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz and to avoiding that the Iranians take control of that situation. There is less Western attention for Ukraine simply because all our eyes are now fixed on the Middle East. And the Middle East conflict is taking on more scenarios. It's on the one hand, it started with Gaza. You know that's already a couple of years that Israel has been fighting down Hamas in Gaza and thereby destroying most of the Gaza Strip. Huge humanitarian losses. Since a couple of weeks, basically since the start of the war, we're now in the third week of the war, Israel has been in parallel bombing Hezbollah's position in Lebanon and is destroying targets in the city of Beirut. So hundreds of people have been killed there as well, which means there are lots of old conflicts and old kind of enemy situations that are now coming to the surface again. This all plays into Putin's attempt to draw attention away from Ukraine. And the more drones are being sent from Iran into the Arab states, and the more Americans need anti-aircraft, anti-missile missiles and anti-drone weapons, the less they will be able to spend on Ukraine, that is to send in order to support Ukraine. Ukraine is still being hailed by Russian drones. And you can see the calamities in cities like Kiev and Kharkiv every day in the news, just not on the front pages anymore, because they have been dominated by the Middle East. With our ships being sent to the Eastern Mediterranean, then to the Red Sea, maybe another conflict with the Houthi rebels in Yemen that also count as Iran's allies in the area, we are being drawn into another conflict there. And our ships, that is the French aircraft carrier, but also the Evertsen, the Dutch frigate, and a couple of other ships, they came from the Arctic. They were doing maneuvers around Greenland as part of this attempt by NATO to ensure that Trump gets the idea NATO is present in the waters around the Arctic, to dispel his allegation that only the Americans can save Greenland from being annexed by China or by the Russians. So these ships that are usually patrolling the Arctic waters in order to keep control on that area, or the Baltic Sea in order to maintain control of the Russian shadow fleet that is coming out of St. Petersburg and then passing by the coast of Poland, between Poland and Finland, and then Germany and Denmark, boats will be taken from there and be shipped around Europe into the Mediterranean in order to play a defensive role in the Eastern Mediterranean. This, of course, is another cause for concern because it means we are making our northern flanks, the Baltic Sea and the Arctic, more vulnerable to any kind of military adventures that might be taking place there. Yeah, I leave it for this, and I want to focus now on Putin, who is obviously in a very bad situation concerning the war, because after all, we have to understand this war has been going on for 4 years now, and the Russian progress at the front is minimal. If anybody had told a military expert in 2022 that this war would drag on for 4 years and mighty Russia is not able to conquer or destroy or at least to take half of Ukraine and the capital of Kiev, everybody would have laughed them away. So the steadfastness of the Ukrainians is obviously much bigger than it was thought in 2022, but also Russia made so many serious military and strategic mistakes that it hasn't advanced much. However, at the same time, it is standing in Ukraine and it is destroying infrastructure, the heating over the winter, of course, the water supply. There is more and more civil infrastructure is being targeted by the Russians to make the lives of Ukrainians miserable and to bring down their war morale, but also to bring down our morale, namely to create a kind of fatigue of this war so that Ukraine, but also the European Union member states and the EU itself would have to give in to any kind of peace at Russia's dictate. So that Russia wants these territories, but even more territories. Russia wants that Ukraine will never be allowed to NATO membership. And Ukraine, of course, wants NATO membership because it sees without any kind of strong backing by the West, Ukraine will always remain vulnerable to Russian military conquest. So these are the 2 points, territory and protection by NATO, or at least by security guarantees from the big NATO powers. And Ukraine is stuck in this since 22. I will now move to Putin, because in Putin's career, this war also means a big change, and something has been happening in Russia. Not only that we put sanctions on Russia, we're not fighting a war against Russia, but we're supporting the Ukrainians defending themselves against Russia, and Russia has been isolating itself, has been isolated from the West, and has been isolating itself from the West. Tomorrow I will talk about similar developments in Hungary. Hungary is a member state of the European Union, but also Hungary has turned to the east in order to make itself, at least this is the discourse, less depending on the European Union. So we see a Russia that is breaking away from Europe since 2014, but in particular since 22. Now first, is Putin a populist? You know populism from your own countries, from the Netherlands or the UK or Germany, wherever you go, we have populists. Populism is, in a nutshell, the idea that a political leader is positioning himself as the voice of the ordinary citizens who have been neglected by the elites. That is, by those that are ruling, that are in parliament, that are in government, that do the business, and so forth. So the voice of the simple, usual citizen against some evil elites. Putin is posing, and is very popular. This is what I want to show you with the election results, presidential elections. He has been re-elected with gigantic results in the first round. So in the US or in other countries, you would dream of these results. In the US, you would always have 50-50 around that part, and then 1 or 2 percentages can make the difference. In many countries, you have a second round, because in the first round you have several contenders. In the second round, you have the 2 most successful contenders of the first round. This is also the case in Ukraine, for instance. Putin never faced that. He always won in the first round. So he seems to be very popular. And there are observers who say Putin is very concerned about his popularity. And he's trying to maintain and to foster the image of a president who is there for his citizens, who is always caring for individuals. So, for instance, every year he has a talk show where he's been addressed by people from all over the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, who ask about certain calamities in their region, why money has not been coming to the school building in Nizhny Novgorod, or why a police officer was detained although he didn't do anything. And then Putin, in this yearly talk show, addresses this concern by particular selected citizens directly and then calls the governor in order to take care of this issue. So this is a very populist kind of thing, namely to say, I'm the father of the nation, and it's not like me telling my minister to talk to the governor, but I call the governor myself and make him shit in his pants. This shitting in the pants is a very important aspect because there is much violence involved in the way he talks and in the way how he orders things to be done. That is, we're talking about somebody who is using a very brutal speech, but at the same time who is also having the institutions at his disposal for carrying out this violence in life. So while Putin is having this populist kind of image, at the same time, the populism definition that puts a focus on the anti-elite discourses does not work with Putin, because the elites of Russia are fully in his grip, and he's very much favoring them and doing them favors wherever he can to keep them happy under his regime. With other words, we're talking about a regime, the Putin regime, that is on the one hand, yes, the strong man on top, but this strong man also depends on the elites, and that is the economy, and with these people we call oligarchs, millionaires if you wish, billionaires, tycoons, as they were called in the US in the 1930s, the big CEOs, as we call them today. And these people all made their fortunes in the 1990s by extraordinary means, in particular by the selling out of the state property of the USSR and buying companies, buying banks, buying whatever infrastructure at a very low price, and then reselling that at a higher price. So they all made their fortunes in the 1990s, largely, and they are now very much Putin's own economic elite. Whenever somebody is trying to contend, trying to break out of Putin's control, he will be eliminated. The other word, so the one word I want you to learn is, of course, this oligarchs. That is the way how the economy is run. The other word is siloviki, and that is the people who have sila, who have power. And the siloviki, here in yellow, are the ministries that use violence, that have weapons. It's in the first place the police, the army, but also the FSB, which is the Federal Service of Intelligence, the Secret Service, is counted among the Siloviki. And Putin is himself from the Secret Service, so in Soviet times he was in the KGB. Then under Yeltsin in the 1990s, he became head of one of the post-Soviet intelligence service in Russia. And from then on he started his career as prime minister and then as president. So Putin himself comes from the Secret Service. He's been trained as an agent, as an officer. And he witnessed the coming down of the Soviet Union in Eastern Germany, in Dresden in 1989, when there were big demonstrations in Eastern Germany, in the GDR, to reunite with Western Germany. And at that time, he was defending, this is how he says, the Russian consulate in Dresden, the Soviet consulate, and he was so depressed by seeing that Russia had become so weak that the idea to reassure Russia and to make Russia great again became a central tenet of how he presents himself in public. How does Putin win these elections? Why do the Russians, if I go back to these numbers here, in so big numbers vote for Putin? For the last elections after 2012, they are highly doubtful, because at that time, Putin had already arranged a system of rigged elections, of incarcerating competitors, of not allowing people to run for president, and of controlling the media, controlling the business that owns the media. So these numbers here are highly questionable. However, it is difficult to reject the idea that Putin is still popular among a huge part of the Russian population in spite of the war. Or maybe because of the war, because the war is, on the one hand, an opportunity for changing a regime if it loses legitimacy among the population. At the same time, the war is also a time when a regime can crack down on opposition without being challenged, without being punished for that. With other words, the naturalization of violence in war against an outsider also naturalizes violence against your own citizens. This is also what you see in Iran, right? The defense minister appears on the news of Iran and says, if protesters now go to the streets, they will be seen as enemies. So they will be directly shot at. This is why there are no protests in Iran. It's not like Iran is being bombed, hooray, we are now going out to the street and demand our different regime. The opposite is true. For Russia, it seems to be the same thing. Putin is very firmly in the saddle, at least this is what we learn. How has he been managing to cement his control of the state, of the administration, but also of the economy, of the media, of the public, and of society? On the one hand, by censorship. Censorship has usually been circumvented when it comes to social media, but over the past years, Russia has also enforced its legislation on social media, and we are in a period where WhatsApp, for instance, but also TikTok and other devices are no longer working or are working very intermittently. So only sometimes we get contact with our Russian friends. YouTube is supposed to be banned, all that kind of stuff. Russian citizens still get their ways around it, so they get their VPNs and try to get out whatever they want to say. But at the same time, you can never be sure about who is listening, who is watching what you are writing. So the social media that once had been an instrument of protest, namely to quickly mobilize people for going out to the street, has been turned into a device of the state, of state repression. The foreign agent law is something that you might have heard in various contexts. It's a law that makes it mandatory for any NGO, non-government organization, that gets money from abroad to make visible that they are foreign agents. And the word foreign agents already makes it clear that this is supposed to be a kind of marker of treason. Foreign agents are marked as traitors to the nation, to the Russian nation in this context, and it is meant to expel NGOs and destroy them that have ideas about the state that are not Putin's, especially when they are being connected to the West. Russia has a parliament, has parliamentary elections. I think September, October is the time when the parliament is being elected again. But the parliament is completely dominated by one party, by the Yedinaya Rossiya, United Russia party, that is supposed to be Putin's party of power. So they have more than 50%, and therefore Putin can enforce any law that he wants to introduce through his own party in parliament. Not only that, also other parties in parliament, the communists included, do what Putin wants. So the other parties in parliament are not in opposition, but they are basically subjected, they are basically co-opted. Co-opted meaning they are bought off, they are behaving as they are supposed to behave according to the Kremlin. The Kremlin puts forward a proposition for a law, and all these parties would talk about that one day, and then they would consent. So Putin can legitimize his rule through his United Russia party that has a supermajority in parliament, including in addition to other parties. He can manipulate oppositionists, and one most popular example is Alexei Navalny, whom you might have heard of. He died in prison. He was imprisoned after he returned to Russia. He was flown out to Germany after a poison attack on his life. In Germany, he recuperated from the poison attack and then said, I have to go back to Russia. I can't remain in the West. Here in the West, I'm probably safe. But if I want to change Russia, I can do that only in Russia itself. So he returned, and he was already intercepted at the airport, directly brought before trial. And he was trialed for tax evasion, for any kind of things that would put him into prison, that would not allow him to run for president. He would be the one contender that might really, if there were fair and free elections, have outnumbered Putin's votes. And these allegations pile up and pile up. In the end, when he was already in prison, he was given another prison sentence of 15 years or so on allegations of extremism. And extremism is the catchword in Russia's discourse for anti-state activities and treason to the nation. So basically, he would have ended his life in prison. And indeed, he did end his life, and most probably he was poisoned there. There was much speculation about why the Russians would not let his mother to observe and to retain his body, obviously to avoid any kind of investigation of what he had been poisoned with, because that would backfire against the Kremlin. So this was already during the war, and the war situation accelerates this repression. The more the war makes violence a daily occurrence, the more people are concerned with their own survival in this regime. The economy has been slowly going down. You don't want to be drawn into the army. There is no mass mobilization of all able-bodied persons in Russia for the war machine, but there are huge amounts of contracts being made with individuals. So you go to the army, you get a contract for 2 years, and then you're being released from prison, or you get $20,000 or whatever. So people are being enticed into the army, being forced into the army, but also if you look at the casualties, where they come from, the war veterans, soldiers that died, these people almost never come from Moscow and St. Petersburg, but they come from all over Russia, from the rural areas in particular. So people sign up for the army in order to get a decent income, not knowing that they will be used as cannon fodder, or at least cherishing the hope that they would be surviving. Estimations are, Russia has lost around 200,000 people in this war already. And this is what, what media platforms have been able to verify with the help of obituaries and funerals. So really physical evidence that more than 100,000, maybe 200,000 people have died already. Not talking about people who come home without limbs or with serious trauma. At the same time, during the war, of course, the elections in the fall of this year, the parliament elections, not the presidential elections, parliament elections, will be a farce anyway, because people are intimidated and are being harassed. University students are being brought to the ballots together so that your teacher would have an eye on what you, where you make your cross, and you would be identified. There is no exit polling. In the Netherlands, when election time is over, so here on Wednesday we have elections for the municipalities, we will know in the evening who voted for whom in which constituency, largely because there are exit polls. So there are people who walk out, who just made their cross, go out of the voting office, and then they are being asked by reporters or by pollsters, whom did you support in this election? And then the media already know the general trend by closing time. In Russia, there is no independent polling of this kind, no exit polls, which means there is a lot of possibilities. There are lots of possibilities for stuffing polls, that is, for putting hundreds of prefabricated polls into the box, and for manipulating the results that are being transmitted from the election offices to the Central Election Committee. We saw that in many elections. This is what I told you about the parliament. So on paper it looks good. There are parliamentary elections, but you see the blue party is Jedinaja Rusija. The opposition is marginal, and from this opposition, all these other parties here are largely in the pocket of Putin. Not of United Russia necessarily, but of Putin, and would never do something against. Which means everything that I tell you here about the narratives of Putin is being shared by the communists, more or less, by the nationalists, here, A Just Russia, for instance, by the Liberal Democratic Party, a very nationalist, very illiberal party. They share the kind of discourse because there is no alternative to the Putin discourse that I will be talking about. My alarm clock will go in a couple of minutes. This was another strategy of Putin for cementing his power, making Europe dependent on Russian oil and gas. And it worked for a long time. Even, you see the pipelines here that went through Poland, but especially through Ukraine, to Germany and Austria and the Netherlands and so forth. And then the pipeline that we built, including the Netherlands, with Shell through the Baltic Sea. The Baltic Sea then uniting Russia's oil, bringing Russia's oil and Russia's gas directly to Germany without having to fear that Ukraine or Poland could stop it, and without having to pay fees to these countries. So Poland, but also Denmark and other countries were very much against the Nord Stream pipeline. including the US, of course, that said, don't make yourself too depending on Russia. But in particular, Germany was very blindly turning an eye on the developments in Russia. And even when Russia occupied parts of Ukraine in 2014, we still maintained our huge dependence on Russian oil and gas. This only changed in 22 when the war started full scale. That is, when Russia broke all promises. And then it became suddenly clear to us that we cannot rely on Russia, first place. And the second is that by buying Russian oil and gas, even if the prices are lower for us than, for instance, if we would buy the gas elsewhere, we feed the treasury of Russia, and thereby we support the Russian war machine against Ukraine. This is the strategies in the area of law that I mentioned, of media, but there is a broader discourse that Putin has been shaping and has been using all the time. Whenever you hear him talking, he's using historical allegories or historical examples from Russian history in order to make a point about why it is legitimate to conquer another country or to repress the population. So he would always be the history teacher. And this starts with the 1990s, and the 1990s is the period when Russia was in big turmoil. And by 1990, by 1991, the Soviet Union was gone, and the states of the Soviet Union were independent. And at that time, Putin was becoming a big administrator. So he turned from being an agent of the KGB, of the Secret Service, to becoming an administrator in the Kremlin administration. He was invited into the Kremlin administration and became there the head of a real estate department. A real estate department that would manage the estate, that is the land, owned by the Russian Federation abroad. That is all the embassies and all the terrains that were once part of the possession of the Soviet Union were now belonging to the Kremlin. And Putin started his career in the Kremlin not as an agent, but as an administrator of these money flows. So his career is very much connected to money flows of the 1990s, a period that he now makes very bad. He tries to paint the 1990s as the period when Russia was losing, when Russia was almost a loser, when it was powerless, when it lost all the might of the Soviet Union, and when it started to introduce democracy. Demokratia is the key word. Dermo is shit, and demokratia is shit. This is what the word says. So democracy is something that brought Russia down. It was almost like a virus that the West instilled in the Russian body of the nation, and thereby made it weak, and thereby brought Russia down and made America great, and the Europeans. So this is the idea. If you paint the 1990s as a period of crisis, of chaos, of criminality, and of people losing their income, then Putin arises around 2000 as the Messiah who is bringing Russia back to the status that it once had when it was the center of the Soviet Union. Thank you very much. 15 minutes break. Hi again. There is a special term that we call perception management. Perception management is not just propaganda. Perception management is the way how a media discourse is being constructed by framing, by excluding, by othering, by selecting, and by imposing itself in order to make everybody believe in just one vision, one version of the truth. And Russia has been very skillfully using perception management to be able to have the kind of discursive sovereignty over the constructing of what it means to occupy the Crimea, of what it means to support the Donbas rebels. That is, in this perception management, you have several target audiences. One is abroad, namely the West in the first place, to make us believe what the Kremlin says. But there is also the perception towards the domestic population. And in both of these discourses, abroad and at home, there is one strategic narrative that comes over and over again, and that is that of Russia returning to be a great power. And this is a narrative with historical anchor points. And from this list, you see that the times of trouble are an anchor point. That's when Russia, or the Soviet Union, was in crises. So, for instance, around 1600, Russia was in very bad shape. Part of Russia was occupied by Poland. And Putin would present this period as evidence for the hostility of the West towards Russia. Then there is the Great Patriotic War, which is the Russian name for the Second World War. When did the Second World War start? In 1939, yes, but when? According to common wisdom, it started on the 1st of September 1939, when Hitler attacked Poland. But Hitler could attack Poland only because he knew that the Soviet Union would also attack Poland. The Soviet Union started 2 weeks later to attack the eastern part of Poland and include that into the Soviet Union. With other words, the Second World War started in September 1939. In Russian discourse, it started only in June 1941 when the Germans attacked the Soviet Union. So the Great Patriotic War is not just a kind of different word for the same Second World War, but it is a word for the Second World War from a Soviet perspective, namely that the attack on Poland was not part of the war. The war only started when the Germans broke the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the Hitler-Stalin Agreement, and the Treaty of Non-Aggression, and attacked the Soviet Union in 1941. With other words, already the use of these words feeds into the discourse of Russia as the eternal victim and not as the perpetrator. The Second World War, from our perspective, starts in 1939 September, when Poland was annihilated by the Nazis and by the Soviets. From the Soviet and Russian perspective, it only started when the Germans attacked the Soviet Union. So excluding all the atrocities that the Soviet Union committed already in Finland, in Poland, in the Baltic states, and so forth. And from these historical tropes, one could say, Putin derives legitimacy for his war against Ukraine. The war is represented as unification with Ukraine. At least in the beginning, the idea was that Putin would have to show the Ukrainians the right way, namely that their identity is very closely aligned, if not the same as the Russian identity. So the whole war was depicted as a benevolent kind of reunification. The Ukrainians, of course, didn't agree with that. And then come slogans like the denazification operation. This would be the idea that Kiev, the Ukrainian government, and the army and the society is governed by Nazis, and that Putin is just liberating the Ukrainians from Nazi oppression. Nazi today, meaning the Zelensky government would be Nazis. Now Zelensky is the sixth president of Ukraine and the first with Jewish ancestors, but he's depicted as a Nazi. What you see here is that items from the Great Patriotic War are being translated that is from the Second World War and from Stalin's period, translated 1-to-1 into the present time by declaring Ukraine Nazi, and thereby the same as Nazi Germany was in the 1940s. These are rhetorical instruments that shape the image of Ukraine as bad and the image of Russia as a liberator instead of a suppressor. I think I gave you an article about Putin's imagery and how he came to power with this image of masculinity, of a person who is strong, faithful, self-confident. And of course, that also brings us back to his KGB past, that is his past as an agent, the idea that he's a strong man and he has learned his business. He's a very tough negotiator or enforcer of something. This image was very much maintained over the 2000s and 2010s with this military kind of attire that you see here, but at the same time also him playing piano or him singing songs and that kind of stuff. So he was very present in the form of an idealized Russian man that would be tough against other men, but also caring for his nation, for his family, and for his nation as the family. Now this idea that he would be the person who is bringing Russia up again after it had been on its knees in the 1990s, bringing it out of the tutelage of the US and the West. Also out of globalization. Globalization is evil from the Russian perspective because it washes out all identities. Putin's discourse is all about identities. And identities, as you know, are constructs. They are being prepared, they are being maintained, they are being made, they're being designed by people for political purposes. One of these identity markers that Putin uses all the time is the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian Orthodox Church, that is the Russian national church, if you wish, of Christianity, in Moscow with the head of the church, the Patriarch, is becoming a pillar of the regime in the 2000s because their interests align. The Kremlin, that is Putin, is using more and more the rhetorics of the Orthodox Church to display Russia as a traditional society. Now, what is traditional? Traditional is anti-progressive, anti-liberal, anti-leftist. It's anti-Europe. We in Europe are being regarded as liberal in the bad sense, namely as too liberal and thereby losing our own European identity. This is a very strong trope in Russia's discourse. The West is effeminate, the West is weak, and the West has lost belief, including in God, in Jesus, and therefore Russia stands up as the protector of the European values of what Russia has now been leading while we are losing it. This has a lot to do with gender identities. Russia has a very strong anti-LGBT agenda. That is, the Russian state insists on only two genders, on the lack of rights of gay people to show that they are gay, and they are restricting the civil opportunity to express gayness and otherness. This is done by laws that ban what the law calls the propagation of sexual ideologies. We would call this laws against the expression of your gender identities. That is, of everybody's becoming equal, either man or woman, and homosexuality has no place in this. This in a general situation where more and more people in the West, of course, have come to express divergent minority gender identities, and we take it for granted that the society and the state and the legal system is protecting these expressions. With other words, gender identities, or the lack of gender liberties, is a fault line between Russia and Europe, Russia and the European Union, where these things have become part of our mainstream discourse. But it's also misogynic. That is, it has a strong attitude against women. It's anti-feminist. Anti-feminist not in the sense that it's banning feminist ideologies, but it's restricting the role of women and the strive for equal rights. Equal rights have not been attained in the Netherlands or in Germany or elsewhere either, but in Russia they're not being discussed anymore. They're not being part of the goals and aims of the state and of the program. The idea is that the woman has to stay at home, produce children, maybe educate them, or take on jobs as nurses or teachers, but not become really equal on the scale of payments and positions and power. Power is supposed to be manly, whereas the home is supposed to be feminine. This is a picture of the punk band Pussy Riot. Maybe some of you have heard about them. 2012, they sang a song in the Moscow Cathedral. So in this central cathedral of Moscow, they just went into it when there was almost nobody there. They took the stage and sang the punk prayer, asking Mother Mary to do away with Putin. Okay, so here's crazy punk girls, known as an avant-garde punk band. And they take the stage and they then send it out by YouTube. Everybody in the world can see it. They obtained prison sentences for that, at least 2 of them, I believe. Others escaped, or others simply gave in. And the public outcry in Russia was big against this. On the one hand, it was Mother Mary, do away with Putin, take away Putin, which is an assault of the president, at that time, president or prime minister. But at the same time, it is also a sacrilege to do a punk prayer in the cathedral. So from then on, the laws have been made stronger that protect the feelings of believers. With other words, the feeling of believers who feel insulted by these punk girl bands is ranked higher than the freedom of expression. And this performance was a catalyst for more restrictive legislation against the expression of gender identities, but also of criticism against the Putin regime. I'm now bringing you into a timeline of Putin's wars, because this domestic development that I just brought to your attention, with the introduction of this traditionalism, conservatism discourse, which in reality is an enforcement of Putin's elite, their grip on the population and the extinction of any kind of dissent, including political parties, but also political and civil society dissent, was accompanied by several wars. And these wars have been building up. And with these wars, we go again into our discussion of international law. The first war was the war that brought Putin into power. Because Putin was, in the 1990s, a nobody. Nobody knew him. He was having an important position in the Kremlin administration, as I told you. But when he was positioned into the role of president by his predecessor, Boris Yeltsin, who said, I'm now retiring, this is the person whom the Russian nation should elect as president. By that time, nobody knew him. And in order to make himself visible and popular, he brought up a big campaign against Chechnya. Chechnya is, at that time, a breakaway republic from the Russian Federation, has fought a war in the 1990s, and this war led to a stalemate between Russia and this breakaway republic. You see, we're talking about this white spot here on the southern border of Russia, where Russia is bordering Georgia in the Caucasus. So Chechnya had seen a war, and the Russians lost that first war. This loss of the first war in the 1990s contributes to the image of Russia being weak, of not even being able to reintegrate this breakaway republic of Chechnya. For the Russians, this was crucial. The idea was, if Chechnya breaks away, maybe the other republics that you see here, they are also part of the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation is consisting of 85, 89 different areas, some of which have the status of republics. If one of these would go, maybe the others go as well, and then Russia would crumble. Nothing came of that. Russia didn't crumble. Chechnya was the only outlier, the only region that wanted to be out of the Russian Federation, and that has a lot to do with the massive repression that the Chechens faced from the hands of the Russians in the 19th century and in the Soviet Union in the 1940s, when the whole population of the Chechens and Ingush was taken out of this area, put onto cattle freight trains and brought to Kazakhstan, where they were resettled in earthen holes, basically, and could return only much later. With other words, there's a strong history of Russian and Soviet repression of Chechens and a strong history of Chechen violent resistance against the Russians. In the 1990s, Russia lost, and it was contributing to this loss of face of Russia and the loss of prestige and of self-assurance. When Putin became prime minister first in 1999 and then president, he immediately started a new campaign against Chechnya. And by that time, the Russian army had been reorganized, had been better equipped, and most importantly, the Chechen resistance had been bought off. With other words, the resistance that is the Chechen leadership, was no longer united in its fight against Russia, able to defend Chechnya from a second Russian incursion, but to the contrary, was partly going into the camp of the Kremlin and partly being split over various factions. Here the argument of Putin is territorial integrity. So from our duality of the right of nations of self-determination and the right of the sovereignty of the state, he would be on the sovereignty of the state side here. He would say, this is the Russian Federation, and of course we have the right to reintegrate a breakaway republic. And the West let that go. We didn't have much of a complaint about that, simply because Chechnya was indeed a very weak state, and partly with Islamic terrorists bordered in, that is hosted by Chechen rebels. And we had enough to do with Yugoslavia at that time. This is happening at the same time as the West is using its NATO forces against the Serbs in Kosovo. Last week I told you about Kosovo. NATO intervened with airstrikes in 1999, at exactly the time when this starts here, in order to push Serbia out of Kosovo and to protect the population of the Kosovo Albanians. So from the Russian perspective, if the West is doing this, then we can do the same thing, and indeed the West didn't bother. What happened then with Chechnya is that Putin, in his rhetoric and in his policies, tried to avoid the impression that this is a war of Russia against the Chechens. In order to avoid the idea that Russia is just continuing colonial governance, just continuing to act as an imperialist and colonialist power, Putin enforced a Chechenization of the conflict. That is, he put Chechens in charge of Chechnya so that Chechnya would have a Chechen governor. And this governor would, for the Kremlin, do the dirty work of fighting against the other Chechens who were not happy with being reintegrated into the Russian Federation. This war continued from 1999 to probably 2008, with resistance continuing in the mountains and in the forests of Chechnya. What's important then is this figure, Ramzan Kadyrov, who is still in power. His son was the first governor of Chechnya under Putin, and when his father, Ahmed, was the first governor by Putin, and when this father was killed in 2003, Ramzan became the designated successor, and he's still there. Today, he's in bad shape. We know that he has suffering from kidney failure, and the world is looking at Chechnya. Will one of his sons now become the new ruler of Chechnya, or somebody else? So what's important is that Chechnya was reintegrated into the Russian Federation, but at the price of paying much money to this gentleman, and thereby putting Chechnya into a very peculiar position towards other parts of the Russian Federation. It's still very different from other parts that do not have the same amount of autonomy and the same amount of money in order to act at the will of Ramzan Kadyrov. A second important development of Putin's early years is the colored revolutions. Now, the colored revolutions were events first in Georgia, in the Caucasus, and then in Ukraine in 2004, where huge amounts of people went to the streets, and you see that here from Ukraine, and demanded in 2004 a rerun of the presidential elections, because they said the election results have been falsified. If the state is falsifying the elections, people would go to the street and demonstrate. Huge demonstrations need a trigger, they need an event, they need something that unites the people against the government. So in Georgia that was elections, in here it was also elections. In 2014, the same kind of procedure happened in Kiev, in Ukraine, but this time the trigger was not elections, but the failed association agreement with the European Union, with the president backing down from a long-term development towards including Ukraine not into the European Union, but into the orbit of the European Union by this association agreement. That's 2014. 2004, this event that a new government comes into power in Kiev, the new elections, new president, pro-Western, and then starts what we call economic statecraft. Economic statecraft means that one state imposes sanctions on another state. We've been seeing that since the coming of power of Trump. He does that every week, imposing new tariffs onto particular countries that he wants to hurt. Putin has been doing that all the time, including, for instance, declaring that all the dairy products of Ukraine that are being exported to Russia are infected by something, so that Ukraine cannot export its dairy products. Or Georgian wine can no longer be sent into Russia, and so forth. Usually under some very easily detectable pretexts, but hurting the economy of another state, and thereby imposing Russia's will onto these states. And this happened repeatedly in the 2000s and 2010s with the examples of Ukraine and Georgia. One important element that Russia had at its disposal until today, or until the war, is gas prices. Russia would lower gas prices for Ukraine or Georgia in order to achieve pro-Russian policies and pro-Russian governments in these countries, and it would punish these countries when they have a pro-Western government, which means this is a very effective weapon. With gas and oil prices, you hurt the population and you try to make the population vote against the pro-Western governments, and at the same time you manage to infiltrate the country with the oil and gas companies of these countries, which are bribed, corrupted, and thereby become Russian puppets. This is what we saw in Georgia, but also in Ukraine. Ukraine was undermined by pro-Russian businessmen who benefited from Russia's policies on oil and gas infiltration into Ukraine. The same with Georgia, where we still have a government that is largely a puppet of the Russian. Hybrid warfare is the next step. I talked about perception management, the management of the idea that Russia is narrating, namely Russia as the victim, Russia as having the right to rise up again, the perception of Russia's pretensions towards its neighbors as something that they deserve, that are legitimate, that should not be prohibited by the West. Then I talked about economic statecraft, namely the pressure that Russia can put on its neighbors simply by virtue of its huge economic power. And the last in this triad before the war starts is hybrid warfare, and that means interventions into the media, but also into elections. There were many allegations about Russian interferences in the US elections, the infiltration of the German parliament in Germany, for instance, and the use of Russian media that project the Kremlin narratives. Okay, that sounds clear. This is maybe what every country has been doing, but there are some specifics about that, and that is the blatant lie. The very targeted construction of fake news, and they're not always black and white. It's not about constructing a stream of narratives that is pro-Putin, but it's about constructing a parallel streams of narratives that undermine the Western standpoints, that undermine democracy, and that undermine trust. So what you get, and what you also got in the Netherlands in the referendum the referendum against the association agreement with Ukraine 10 years ago, is that the Russians would not simply say that Putin is right, but they would say that the Netherlands is too dependent on Brussels. The Netherlands is run by a kind of hidden elite that is exploiting the population. The Netherlands are run over by migrants from the Middle East, and the government wants to replace our population by a Middle Eastern Muslim population. And this boils down to accusations of child pornography and you name it. So a constant flux of allegations that do not need to be proven, that need no evidence because they don't have evidence. but that come in parallel and thereby work on the minds of Western audiences, destroying the trust in the system of democracy, in the parties and in the governments that run them, but also in the international standpoints. What do I care about international law if my country is run by decrepit child pornographers? With other words, it is the creating of doubt and distrust in the wider world that would put Russia at an advantage, because the Russian narrative is always, we are clear of that, we are traditional, we don't have these affinities towards sexual minorities, so we can blame the West for fostering that. This is hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare then goes on to destroying infrastructures, to putting down banks, for instance. That happened in Estonia in 2005, if I'm not mistaken, or 2008. So that you test out in how far you can wage a war without using weapons, just using information and disinformation as weapons. The real violent conflict started in 2008 when Russia intervened in Georgia. Remember, 2003, there is Georgia having a democratic turnover. The old regime that was pro-Russian, or at least kind of pro-Russian, was gone, and a pro-Western regime comes into being. And at that time, until today, basically, you have two regions in Georgia, that is Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which are breakaway areas. Breakaway areas means the people that live there are not Georgians, or at least not fully Georgians. There are also Georgian populations there, but these regions are named after the Abkhaz, which is another nation, and the Ossetinians. And the Ossetians are an old Iranian nation, so they're speaking a language close to Iranian, and the Abkhaz speak another Caucasus language. So the Abkhaz are not the majority in Abkhazia. In Abkhazia you also have Armenians and Russians and other nations, and South Ossetia is very sparsely populated, and you have very few South Ossetians living in South Ossetia. But these breakaway areas in Georgia were taken as puppets for the Kremlin to destabilize Georgia. So when Georgia tried to launch a campaign to reintegrate these separatist territories, it had to confront the Russians that were also stationed there, because there was a ring of Russian peacekeepers around South Ossetia. So when the Georgians tried to reintegrate territories into their land and not under their control, the Russians launched a major military campaign and defeated the Georgians. 2008, the world was in surprise. What happened? On the one hand, the president of Georgia obviously made a huge miscalculation, thinking that he would be able to do a blitzkrieg in order to regain South Ossetia and do that without having to fear a Russian revenge or a Russian kind of incursion. He might also have hoped that the US, under Bush Jr. at that time, would support him. They didn't. The Russians had a very easy game in defeating the limited Georgian troops and were close to taking Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. But then they stopped, and within a couple of months they retreated, except from the area around South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So since that time, South Ossetia and Abkhazia have been recognized by Russia as independent states, only by Russia and Nicaragua, if I'm not mistaken. And the rest of the world still counts these territories as being Georgian, including the European Union. And Russia has not integrated them, has not annexed them, but is in control of these areas and thereby also in control of Georgia. It has a strong leverage on Georgia. At the same time, Russia tried to construct something that would be the equivalent of the European Union, namely a trade and economical union with other states of the former Soviet Union. Here you see Belarus in it, Kazakhstan, but also Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, and Armenia. Armenia is also part of this economic trade union, if you wish. As you know, the European Union is a very difficult, complex kind of institutions. It's been made up of delegates coming from the individual member states. The Council is the kind of meeting board for the prime ministers or the ministers of the member states. The European Parliament is there with delegates being elected from the member states, and the European Commission is being put in charge by the Parliament, also with quotas, so that every nation of the European Union is somehow involved on various levels of governance in the European Union. In this Eurasian Union that Putin is creating, there is nothing of that kind. The only thing they have is meetings of the head of states, so the presidents would meet, and that's it. And the rest is basically Russia imposing its own vision on Kazakhstan, Belarus, and the other states involved in it. With other words, it's supposed to be a kind of counterpart of the European Union, but it lacks the procedural clarity, the transparency of the European Union, and it is basically just the game of the states, of the heads of states of these countries, and thereby of Putin and Russia as the major players. Is Ukraine needed for this? Is the idea that Putin needs Ukraine and thereby has to do this war because he needs the economic power of Ukraine, which was in the Soviet Union second only to Russia? The argument would be possibly he wants to have it because the Ukrainian industry was agriculture very much connected to the Russian market and to Russian industries, but at the same time, Russia doesn't really need Ukraine. Russia has the same industries and the same agricultural production and could easily do without that. However, if Ukraine becomes member of the European Union, or if it is being associated to the European Union, then, of course, you would have a different model of development right at the border of Russia, and thereby Ukraine would be cut off from Russia because you need then the external boundary of the European Union. Now, this idea that Ukraine should be drawn into the orbit, into the neighborhood of the European Union, had its peak in 2013, when the president of Ukraine was supposed to sign the association agreement with the European Union. The association agreement is not an agreement about making Ukraine a member of the European Union. To the contrary, the instrument of association was introduced as a replacement of promises of membership. At that time, the European Union did not want to enlarge. The idea was, we are broad enough. We should now reform our institutions, and maybe then later in the faraway future we can look at who else can be integrated. The new members that became part of the European Union in 2004 and 2007, so Bulgaria, Romania, for instance, meant there was much construction ahead in these countries. So why should we include Ukraine as well, and then also use our regional funds, our development funds, our European budget for improving the economy of Ukraine? At the same time, the European rationale was, we need to bind Ukraine to the European Union, but we need another device for that. A device that would be an instrument that would be a long-term process for bringing Ukraine closer to the legislation of the European Union. This was the association agreement. The European Union made association agreements with Georgia as well, and with Moldova, with the whole of North Africa and so forth. So that means putting these countries into a privileged position, but demanding from them that they should adapt the legislation, fight corruption, and make trade with the European Union possible without trade barriers in the medium run, so that visa would be possible, or visa-less freedom of mobility would be possible, but not immediately. It would be a kind of transformation process for a long time. When the president decided to not sign it, the president of Ukraine decided to not sign it, hell broke out in Kiev, because the people had been in Kiev, in the city, in the capital of Ukraine, had been very much hoping that Yanukovych would do that he would be supporting the association of Ukraine into the European Union, into the orbit, into the neighborhood of the European Union. The president of Ukraine, Yanukovych at that time, was under heavy pressure by Putin. And Putin said, if you sign that, this is almost like war. We will put pressure on you, we will destroy your economy. If you don't sign that, we give you another loan. Russian loans come without strings attached. That means the Russians give loans in order to bind Ukraine to Russia. The World Monetary Fund, or the Western platforms, give loans and demand something in return, namely a reform of the administration, a reform of the legal system, transparency, the rule of law, and so forth. Russia gives money away not to impose the rule of law, as the European Union does, not to reform the country, but to the opposite, to foster corruption. So taking money from the Russians would mean corruption. Taking money from the West would mean the necessity to reform Ukraine. And the president, under Russian pressure, decided to not sign this association agreement. What you then get is a couple of months of protests in the streets in the middle of winter, and about 100 people being killed by the police, by the special forces of the president. There was a time when it looked like there's an agreement, and here you see Steinmeier, who was the German foreign minister at that time, and Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, former boxer, signing an agreement with Yanukovych that Yanukovych would announce early elections. So there was a European attempt, also by France and Poland, to stabilize the situation in Kiev by arranging the possibility that the population of Kiev, of Ukraine, would go to the polls again and elect a new president, and thereby make their decision about whether they want to be part of the Russian sphere of influence or want to be in the European neighborhood with an association agreement. Once this was signed, Yanukovych disappeared. He went to Russia and still claimed to be president of Ukraine, but defected, basically, and left Kiev alone, which means this is the point when a new government forms itself in Kiev, as the president has broken his agreement that he just made with the European leaders in Kiev. There's a power vacuum, and in this power vacuum, as a new transitional government is being forming, Russians invade the Crimea. Here you see on this map, you see the 2 points that have caught our attention since then. One is the Crimea, that Russia occupied with the help of Russian forces that were already on the Crimean Peninsula, because there was a Russian naval base and still is. And you see the red area, which is the Donbas, where Russia did not invade with armies, but where Russia supported so-called rebels that broke away from Kiev. Many of these rebels were Russian citizens being brought to the area in order to cause trouble. So what this meant for Crimea is that there's a process of perception management coming from the Kremlin now, telling us that the taking of the Crimea is legitimate, that Russia has a right to take it, because there is chaos in Kiev. In Kiev, you just have the president just left the country, and the country is and Kiev is in turmoil. There is no military rule over. No military orders are being sent out to the garrisons from Kiev to the Crimea, and Russia has an easy game taking over. The people who take over are in uniform, but they don't show their insignia. So they don't show that they are from the Russian army. They pretend to be simply local forces that take the Crimea into their own hands. And you see here the blueprint for recognizing the independence of Crimea that is being done by a referendum that is very intransparent. And then the Crimean parliament issues and addresses the Russian president and asks for annexation. So the first step is military occupation, the exclusion of any opposition, of course. Many people would flee, would escape from the Crimea. Then this referendum, which is obviously under Russian military pressure, and then the request of the Crimea to accept the Crimea into the Russian Federation. If you see the questions of this referendum, the first referendum question is, do you want to be part of Russia? The second is, do you want to be part of Ukraine? There is already no question of, do you want to be an independent state? Crimea just gained its independence by Russia's military occupying Crimea and expelling everybody else. But this independence was never a concern, it was never a goal, it was just the springboard for this referendum that, of course, would lead to a predictable outcome, namely the majority of the population who did vote according to the official outcome would vote for being annexed by Russia. And this is what happens. And then Putin asks the Russian parliament to accept Crimea into the Russian Federation, and a day later, the parliament accepts Crimea. Since then, Russia believes that the Crimean Peninsula, belongs to the Russian Federation. This already was enough for preventing that Ukraine would be able to join NATO, because NATO would never accept a new partner that is in war with somebody else, in here with the Russian Federation. But on top of that, as Ukraine could not simply relinquish Crimea, Ukraine was also faced with the rebels in the Donbas. The Donbas people who were in rebellion were some Ukrainian citizens, but they were largely led by people who worked for the Secret Service and for the Russian military. So they would come to the Donbas and incite and organize resistance against Ukraine. The Ukrainians, at that time coming out of their weak situation of this interim period, in the summer of 2014, sent all troops they had to the Ukrainians east in order to fight down these rebels. And these rebels would be supported by the Russian army, by Russian officers, and by Russian weapons. And one of these weapons that they obviously obtained from the Russian army were missiles that shot down the airliner that flew from Schiphol to Indonesia, the Indonesian airliner MH17, with almost 300 people on board, almost 200 of them, I believe. 193 were Dutch. The reaction by the Western governments was very weak, or very moderate, or very careful, if you wish. The Rutte government did not say this is Russia who shot down our airliner, but the Dutch government started an investigation team. The investigation team went to Ukraine to bring home the remnants of the airplane, so that they would be here in the Netherlands, would be investigated for several years, trying to get Russian support for finding out where the missile came from. The Russians immediately claimed this was not a Russian missile, because obviously we don't have any relations to the Donbas rebels. This was Putin's dogma at that time. The rebels in Ukraine, that's not our concern. We don't deliver weapons. Everybody knew the Russians would be doing that, but Putin still denied. At the same time, they claimed that this was a Ukrainian missile that brought down the airliner, because the Ukrainians would have an interest in creating such a tragedy to raise the awareness of the West and make the West support Ukraine. But they also came with other kind of fake news at the same time, so this stream of fake news to confuse Western minds about that. And this is exactly the time when the referendum in the Netherlands got organized, and the referendum was about the association agreement. Should we accept Ukraine as an associated partner of the European Union? And also in this process, Russia intervened with pro-Russian narratives that were not about Ukraine, but that were about Brussels. So feeding into skepticism towards the European Union, a skepticism towards migration, and arguing there would be waves of Ukrainians coming to Europe and to the Netherlands. At the same time, so the Russians continued their support for these Donbas rebels. I'm closing here now. I will continue with this tomorrow briefly, also looking at the Ukrainian position, looking at, once again, at these distinctions between sovereignty and self-determination. Thank you very much for your attention. Merci.
you.